Security, 1919 to 1935. France sought security after 1918 by a series of alternatives. As a first choice, it wanted to detach the Rhineland from Germany. This was prevented by the Anglo-Americans. As a second choice, France wanted a league with teeth. That is, a league of nations with an international police force empowered to take automatic and immediate action against an aggressor. This was blocked by the Anglo-Americans. As compensation for the loss of these first two choices, France accepted a third choice, an Anglo-American Treaty of Guarantee. But this was lost in 1919 by the refusal of the United States Senate to ratify the agreement and the refusal of Britain to assume the burden alone. In consequence, the French were forced back on a fourth choice, allies to the east of Germany. The chief steps in this were the creation of the Little Entente, to enforce the Treaty of Trianon against Hungary in 1920 to 1921, and the bringing of France and Poland into this system to make it a coalition of satisfied powers. The Little Entente was formed by a series of bilateral alliances between Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. This was widened by a French-Polish treaty, February 1921, and a French-Czechoslovak treaty, January 1924. This system contributed relatively little to French security because of the weakness of these allies, except Czechoslovakia, and the opposition of Britain to any French pressure against Germany along the Rhine, the only way in which France could guarantee Poland or Czechoslovakia against Germany. In consequence, France continued its agitation both for a British guarantee and to put teeth to the League of Nations. Thus, France wanted security, while Britain had security. France needed Britain, while Britain regarded France as a rival outside Europe, especially in the Near East, and the chief challenge to Britain's customary balance of power policy in Europe. After 1919, the British, and even some Americans, spoke of French hegemony on the continent of Europe. The first rule of British foreign policy for 4 centuries had been to oppose any hegemony on the continent, and to do so by seeking to strengthen the second strongest power against the strongest. After 1919, Britain regarded Germany as the second strongest power, and France as the strongest. A quite mistaken view in the light of population, industrial productivity, and general organizations of the two countries. Because France lacked security, its chief concern in every issue was political. Because Britain had security, its chief concern was economic. The political desires of France required that Germany should be weakened. The economic desires of Britain required that Germany should be strengthened in order to increase the prosperity of all Europe. While the chief political threat to France was Germany, the chief economic and social threat to Britain was Bolshevism. In any struggle with Bolshevist Russia, Britain tended to regard Germany as a potential ally, especially if it were prosperous and powerful. This was the primary concern of Lord D'Abernon, British ambassador in Berlin in the critical years 1920 to 1926. On the other hand, while France was completely opposed to the economic and social system of the Soviet Union, and could not easily forget the immense French investments which had been lost in that country, it still tended to regard the Russians as potential allies against any revival of Germany, although France did not make an alliance with the Soviet Union until 1935. Because of its insecurity, France tended to regard the Treaty of Versailles as a permanent settlement, while Britain regarded it as a temporary arrangement, subject to modification. Although dissatisfied with the treaty, France felt that it was the best that it could hope to get, especially in view of the narrow margin by which Germany had decided to sign it, even when faced with a worldwide coalition. Britain, which had obtained all of her desires before the treaty was signed, had no reluctance to modify it, although it was only in 1935, with the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, that it attempted to modify the colonial, naval, or merchant marine clauses from which it had benefited. But in 1935, it had, for more than 15 years, been seeking to modify the clauses from which France had benefited. The French believed that peace in Europe was indivisible, while the British believed that it was divisible. That means that the French believed that the peace of Eastern Europe was a primary concern of the states of Western Europe, and that the latter states could not allow Germany to move eastward because that would permit her to gain strength to strike back westward. The British believed that the peace of Eastern Europe and that of Western Europe were quite separate things, and that it was their concern to maintain peace in the West, but that any effort to extend this to Eastern Europe would merely involve the West in, quote, every little squabble, unquote, of these continually squabbling, quote, backward, unquote, peoples, and could, as happened in 1914, make a world war out of a local dispute. The Locarno pacts of 1925 were the first concrete achievement of this British point of view, as we shall see. To the French argument that Germany would get stronger and thus more able to strike westward if allowed to grow eastward, the British usually replied that the Germans were equally likely to become satisfied or get mired down in the great open spaces of the East. France believed that Germany could be made to keep the peace by duress, while Britain believed that Germany could be persuaded to keep the peace by concessions. The French, especially the political right in France, could see no difference between the Germans of the Empire and the Germans of the Weimar Republic. Quote, scratch a German, and you will find a Hun, they said. The British, especially the political left, regarded the Germans of the Weimar Republic as totally different from the Germans of the Empire. Purified by suffering and freed from the tyranny of the imperial autocracy, they were prepared to clasp these new Germans to their hearts and to make any concession to encourage them to proceed on the path of democracy and liberalism. When the British began to talk in this fashion, appealing to high principles of international cooperation and conciliation, the French tended to regard them as hypocrites, pointing out that the British appeal to principles did not appear until British interests had been satisfied, and until these principles could be used as obstacles to the satisfaction of French interests. The British tended to reply to the French remarks about the dangers of English hypocrisy with a few remarks of their own about the dangers of French militarism. In this sad fashion, the core of the coalition which had beaten Germany dissolved in a confusion of misunderstandings and recriminations. This contrast between the French and British attitudes on foreign policy is an oversimplification of both. About 1935, there appeared a considerable change in both countries, and, long before that date, there were differences between different groups within each country. In both Britain and France, before 1935, there was a difference of opinion in international politics which followed general political outlooks, and even class lines, rather closely. In Britain, persons who were of the left tended to believe in revision of the Treaty of Versailles in favor of Germany, collective security, general disarmament, and friendship with the Soviet Union. In the same period, the right were impatient with policies based on humanitarianism, idealism, or friendship for the Soviet Union, and wanted to pursue a policy of national interest, by which they meant emphasis on strengthening the empire, conducting an aggressive commercial policy against outsiders, and adopting relative isolationism in general policy, with no European political commitments except west of the Rhine, where Britain's interests were immediate. The groups of the left were in office in Britain for only about 2 years, in the 20 years 1919 to 1939, and then only as a minority government, 1924 and 1929 to 1931. The groups of the right were in power for 18 of these 20 years, usually with an absolute majority. However, during these 20 years, the people of Britain were generally sympathetic to the point of view of the left in foreign policy, although they generally voted in elections on the basis of domestic rather than foreign politics. This means that the people were in favor of revision of Versailles, of collective security, of international cooperation, and of disarmament. Knowing this, the British governments of the right began to follow a double policy, a policy in which they spoke loudly in support of what we have called the foreign policy of the left, and a secret policy in which they acted in support of what we have called the foreign policy of the right. Thus, the stated policy of the government and the policy of the British people were based on support of the League of Nations, of international cooperation, and of disarmament. Yet the real policy was quite different. Lord Curzon, who was Foreign Secretary for 4 years, 1919 to 1923, called the League of Nations, quote, a good joke. Britain rejected every effort of France and Czechoslovakia to strengthen the system of collective security, while openly supporting the Naval Disarmament Conference at Geneva, 1927, and the World Disarmament Conference, 1926 to 1935. Britain signed a secret agreement with France, which blocked disarmament on land as well as on the sea, July 1928, and signed an agreement with Germany, which released her from her naval disarmament, 1935. After 1935, the contrast between the public policy and the secret policy became so sharp that the authorized biographer of Lord Halifax, Foreign Secretary in 1938 to 1940, coined the name diarchy for it. Also, after 1935, these policies of both right and left were changed, the left becoming anti-revisionist as early as 1934, continuing to support disarmament until, in some cases, 1939, and strengthening its insistence on collective security, while the right became more insistent on revisionism, by that time called appeasement, and opposition to the Soviet Union. In France, the contrasts between right and left were less sharp than in Britain, and the exceptions more numerous, not only because of the comparative complexity of French political parties and political ideology, but also because foreign policy in France was not an academic or secondary issue, but was an immediate, frightening concern of every Frenchman. Consequently, differences of opinion, however noisy and intense, were really rather slight. One thing all Frenchmen agreed upon, quote, "It must not happen again," unquote. Never again must the Hun be permitted to become strong enough to assault France, as in 1870 and in 1914. To prevent this, the right and the left agreed. There were two methods: by the collective action of all nations and by France's own military power. The two sides differed in the order in which these two should be used, the left wanting to use collective action first and France's own power as a supplement or a substitute, the right wanting to use France's own power first with support from the League or other allies as a supplement. In addition, the left tried to distinguish between the old Imperial Germany and the new Republican Germany, hoping to placate the latter and turn its mind away from revisionism by cooperative friendship and collective action. The right, on the other hand, found it impossible to distinguish one Germany from another, or even one German from another, believing that all were equally incapable of understanding any policy but force. Accordingly, the right wanted to use force to compel Germany to fulfill the Treaty of Versailles, even if France had to act alone. The policy of the right was the policy of Pinochet and Barthou. The policy of the left was the policy of Briand. The former was used in 1918 to 1924, and briefly in 1934 to 1935. The latter was used in 1924 to 1929. The policy of the right failed in 1924, when Pinochet's occupation of the Ruhr in order to force Germany to pay reparations was ended. This showed that France could not act alone, even against a weak Germany, because of the opposition of Britain and the danger of alienating world opinion. Accordingly, France turned to a policy of the left, 1924 to 1929. In this period, which is known as the, quote, period of fulfillment, unquote, Briand, a foreign minister of France, and Stresemann, as foreign minister of Germany, cooperated in friendly terms. This period ended in 1929. This period ended in 1929, not, as is usually said, because Stresemann died and Briand fell from office, but because of a growing realization that the whole policy of fulfillment, 1924 to 1929, had been based on a misunderstanding. Briand followed a policy of conciliation toward Germany in order to win Germany from any desire to revise Versailles. Stresemann followed his policy of fulfillment toward France in order to win from France a revision of the treaty. It was a relationship of cross purposes, because on the crucial issue, revision of Versailles, Briand stood adamant, like most Frenchmen, and Stresemann was irreconcilable, like most Germans. In France, as a result of the failure of the policy of the right in 1924 and of the policy of the left in 1929, it became clear that France could not act alone toward Germany. It became clear that France did not have freedom of action in foreign affairs and was dependent on Britain for its security. To win this support, which Britain always held out as a bait, but did not give until 1939, Britain forced France to adopt the policy of appeasement of the British right after 1935. This policy forced France to give away every advantage which it had held over Germany. Germany was allowed to rearm, 1935. Germany was allowed to remilitarize the Rhineland, 1936. Italy was alienated, 1935. France lost its last secure land frontier, Spain, 1936 to 1939. France lost all her allies to the east of Germany, including her one strong ally, Czechoslovakia, 1938 to 1939. France had to accept the union of Austria with Germany, which she had vetoed in 1931, March 1938. The power and prestige of the League of Nations was broken, and the whole system of collective security abandoned, 1931 to 1939. The Soviet Union, which had allied with France and Czechoslovakia against Germany in 1935, was treated as a pariah among nations, and lost to the anti-German coalition, 1937 to 1939. And finally, when all these had been lost, public opinion in England forced the British government to abandon the right's policy of appeasement and adopt the old French policy of resistance. This change was made on a poor issue, Poland, 1939, after the possibility of using the policy of resistance had been destroyed by Britain and after France itself had almost abandoned it. In France, as in Britain, there were changes in the foreign policies of the right and the left after Hitler came to power in Germany, 1933. The left became more anti-German and abandoned Bryan's policy of conciliation, while the right, in some sections, sought to make a virtue of necessity and began to toy with the idea that, if Germany was to become strong anyway, a solution to the French problem of security might be found by turning Germany against the Soviet Union. This idea, which already had adherents in the right in Britain, was more acceptable to the right than to the left in France, because, while the right was conscious of the political threat from Germany, it was equally conscious of the social and economic threat from Bolshevism. Some members of the right in France even went so far as to picture France as an ally of Germany in the assault of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, many persons of the right in France continued to insist that the chief, or even the only, threat to France was from the danger of German aggression. In France, as in Britain, there appeared a double policy, but only after 1935, and, even then, it was more of an attempt to pretend that France was following a policy of her own instead of a policy made in Britain, than it was an attempt to pretend it was following a policy of loyalty to collective security and French allies rather than a policy of appeasement. While France continued to talk of her international obligations, of collective security, and of the sanctity of treaties, especially Versailles, this was largely for public consumption. For, in fact, from the autumn of 1935 to the spring of 1940, France had no policy in Europe independent of Britain's policy of appeasement. Thus, French foreign policy in the whole period 1919 to 1939 was dominated by the problems of security. These 20 years can be divided into 5 sub-periods as follows: 1919 to 1924, policy of the right; 1924 to 1929, policy of the left; 1929 to 1934, confusion and transition; 1934 to 1935, policy of the right; 1935 to 1939, dual policy of appeasement. The French feeling that they lacked security was so powerful in 1919 that they were quite willing to sacrifice the sovereignty of the French state and its freedom of action in order to get a League of Nations possessing the powers of a world government. Accordingly, at the first meeting of the League of Nations Committee at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the French tried to establish a league with its own army, its own general staff, and its own powers of police action against aggressors, without the permission of the member states. The Anglo-Americans were horrified at what they regarded as an inexcusable example of, quote, power politics and militarism, unquote. They rode roughshod over the French and drew up their own draft covenant, in which there was no sacrifice of state sovereignty, and where the New World Organization had no powers of its own and no right to take action without the consent of the parties concerned. War was not outlawed, but merely subjected to certain procedural delays in making it, nor was peaceful procedures for settling international disputes made compulsory, but instead were merely provided for those who wished to use them. Finally, no real political sanctions were provided to force nations to use peaceful procedures or even to use the delaying procedures of the covenant itself. Economic sanctions were expected to be used by member nations against aggressor states which violated the delaying procedures of the covenant, but no military sanctions could be used except as contributed by each state itself. The League was thus far from being a world government, although both its friends and its enemies, for opposite reasons, tried to pretend that it was more powerful and more important than it really was. The covenant, especially the critical articles 10 through 16, had been worded by a skillful British lawyer, Cecil Hurst, who filled it with loopholes cleverly concealed under a mass of impressive verbiage, so that no state's freedom of action was virtually restricted by the document. The politicians knew this, although it was not widely publicized, and, from the beginning, those states which wanted a real international organization began to seek to amend the covenant to, quote, plug the loopholes, unquote, in it. Any real international political organization needed three things. 1. Peaceful procedures for settling all disputes. 2. Outlawry of non-peaceful procedures for this purpose. And 3. Effective military sanctions to compel use of the peaceful procedures and to prevent the use of warlike procedures. The League of Nations consisted of three parts. 1. The assembly of all members of the League, meeting generally in September of each year. 2. The Council, consisting of the great powers with permanent seats, and a number of lesser powers holding elective seats for 3-year terms. And 3. The Secretariat, consisting of an international bureaucracy devoted to all kinds of international cooperation and having its headquarters in Geneva. The Assembly, in spite of its large numbers of its infrequent meetings, proved to be a lively and valuable institution, full of hard-working and ingenious members, especially from the secondary powers like Spain, Greece, and Czechoslovakia. The Council was less effective, was dominated by the great powers, and spent much of its time trying to prevent action without being too obvious about it. Originally, it consisted of 4 permanent and 4 non-permanent members, the former including Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Germany was added in 1926. Japan and Germany withdrew in 1933. The Soviet Union was admitted in 1934 and was expelled in 1939 after its attack on Finland. Since the number of non-permanent members was increased during this period, the Council ended up in 1940 with 2 permanent and 11 non-permanent members. The Secretariat was slowly built up and by 1938 consisted of more than 800 persons from 52 countries. Most of these were idealistically devoted to the principles of international cooperation and displayed considerable ability and amazing loyalty during the brief existence of the League. They were concerned with every type of international activity, including disarmament, child welfare, education, the drug traffic, slavery, refugees, minorities, and the codification of international law, the protection of wildlife and natural resources, cultural cooperation, and many others. Attached to the League were a number of dependent organizations. 2. The Permanent Court of International Justice and the International Labor Office were semi-autonomous. Others included the Economic and Financial Organization, the Organization for Communications in Transit, the International Health Organization, with offices in Paris, and the Intellectual Cooperation Organization, with branches in Paris, Geneva, and Rome. Many efforts were made, chiefly by France and Czechoslovakia, to, quote, plug the gaps in the covenant, unquote. The chief of these were the Draft Treaty of Mutual Assistance, 1923, the Geneva Protocol, 1924, and the Locarno Pacts, 1925. The Draft Treaty bound its signers to renounce aggressive war as an international crime, and to bring military assistance to any signer the Council of the League designated to be the victim of an aggression. This project was destroyed in 1924 by the veto of the British Labour government, on the grounds that the agreement would increase the burden on the British Empire without increasing its security. The Assembly at once formulated a better agreement known as the Geneva Protocol. This sought to plug all the gaps in the covenant. It bound its signers to settle international disputes by methods provided in the treaty. Defined as aggressor any state which refused to use these peaceful procedures, bound its members to use military sanctions against such aggressors, and ended the veto power in the Council by providing that the necessary unanimity for Council decisions could be achieved without counting the votes of the parties to the dispute. This agreement was destroyed by the objections of a newly installed Conservative government in London. The chief British opposition to the protocol came from the Dominions, especially from Canada, which feared that the agreement might force them, at some time, to apply sanctions against the United States. This was a very remote possibility in the view of the fact that the British Commonwealth generally had 2 seats on the Council, and one, at least, could use its vote to prevent action, even if the vote of the other was nullified by being a party to the dispute. The fact that both the draft treaty and the Geneva Protocol had been destroyed by Britain led to an adverse public opinion throughout the world. To counteract this, the British devised a complicated alternative known as the Locarno pacts. Conceived in the same London circles which had been opposing France, supporting Germany, and sabotaging the League, the Locarno pacts were the result of a complex international intrigue in which General Smuts played a chief role. On the face of it, these agreements appeared to guarantee the Rhine frontiers, to provide peaceful procedures for all disputes between Germany and her neighbors, and to admit Germany to the League of Nations on a basis of equality with the great powers. The pacts consisted of 9 documents, of which 4 were arbitration treaties between Germany and her neighbors, Belgium, France, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. 2 were treaties between France and her eastern allies, Poland and Czechoslovakia. The 7th was a note releasing Germany from any need to apply the sanctions clause of the covenant against any aggressor nation, on the grounds that Germany, being disarmed by the Treaty of Versailles, could not be expected to assume the same obligations as other members of the League. The 8th document was a general introduction to the pacts, and the 9th document was the Rhine Pact, the real heart of the agreement. This Rhine Pact guaranteed the frontier between Germany and Belgium-France against attack from either side. The guarantee was signed by Britain and Italy, as well as by the 3 states directly concerned, and covered the demilitarized condition of the Rhineland as established in 1919. This meant that if any one of the 3 frontier powers violated the frontier or the demilitarized zone, this violation would bring the 4 other powers into action against the violator. The Locarno Pacts were designed by Britain to give France the security against Germany on the Rhine which France so urgently desired, and at the same time, since the guarantee worked both ways, to prevent France from ever occupying the Ruhr or any other part of Germany, as had been done over the violent objections of Britain in 1923 to 1924. Moreover, by refusing to guarantee Germany's eastern frontier with Poland and Czechoslovakia, Britain established in law the distinction between peace in the East and peace in the West, on which she had been insisting since 1919, and greatly weakened the French alliances with Poland and Czechoslovakia by making it almost impossible for France to honor her alliances with these 2 countries, or to put pressure on Germany in the West if Germany began to put pressure on these French allies in the East, unless Britain consented. Thus, the Locarno Pacts, which were presented at the time throughout the English-speaking world as a sensational contribution to the peace and stability of Europe, really formed the background for the events of 1938, when Czechoslovakia was destroyed at Munich. The only reason why France accepted the Locarno Pacts was that they guaranteed explicitly the demilitarized condition of the Rhineland. So long as this condition continued, France held a complete veto over any movement of Germany either east or west, because Germany's chief industrial districts in the Ruhr were unprotected. Unfortunately, as we have indicated, when the guarantee of Locarno became due in March 1936, Britain dishonored its agreement. The Rhine was remilitarized, and the way was opened for Germany to move eastward. The Locarno pacts caused considerable alarm in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland and Russia. Poland protested violently, issued a long legal justification of her own frontiers, sent her foreign minister to take up residence in Paris, and signed 3 agreements with Czechoslovakia, ending the dispute over Teschin, as well as a commercial treaty and an arbitration convention. Poland was alarmed by the refusal to guarantee her frontiers, the weakening of her alliance with France, and the special status given to Germany within the League of Nations and on the Council of the League, where Germany could prevent sanctions against Russia if Russia ever attacked Poland. To assuage this alarm, a deal was made with Poland by which this country also received a seat on the Council of the League for the next 12 years, 1926 to 1938. The Locarno Pacts and the admission of Germany into the League also alarmed the Soviet Union. This country, from 1917, had had a feeling of insecurity and isolation, which at times assumed the dimensions of mania. For this, there was some justification. Subject to the attacks of propaganda, diplomatic, economic, and even military action, the Soviet Union had struggled for survival for years. By the end of 1921, most of the invading armies had withdrawn, except the Japanese. But Russia continued in isolation and in fear of a worldwide anti-Bolshevik alliance. Germany, at the time, was in similar isolation. The 2 outcast powers drifted together and sealed their friendship by a treaty signed at Rapallo in April 1922. This agreement caused great alarm in Western Europe, since a union of German technology and organizing ability with Soviet manpower and raw materials would make it impossible to enforce the Treaty of Versailles, and might expose much of Europe, or even the world, to the triumph of Bolshevism. Such a union of Germany and Soviet Russia remained the chief nightmare of much of Western Europe from 1919 to 1939. On this last date, it was brought into existence by the actions of the same Western powers. In order to assuage Russian alarm at Locarno, Stresemann signed a commercial treaty with Russia, promised to obtain a special position for Germany within the League so that it could block any passage of troops as sanctions of the League against Russia, and signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, April 26. The Soviet Union, in its turn, as a result of Locarno, signed a treaty of friendship and neutrality with Turkey, in which the latter country was practically barred from entering the League. The Locarno spirit, as it came to be called, gave rise to a feeling of optimism, at least in the Western countries. In this favorable atmosphere, on the 10th anniversary of America's entry into the World War, Briand, the foreign minister of France, suggested that the United States and France renounce the use of war between the 2 countries. This was extended by Frank B. Kellogg, the American Secretary of State, into a multilateral agreement by which all countries could renounce the use of war as an instrument of national policy. France agreed to this extension only after a reservation that the rights of self-defense and of prior obligations were not weakened. The British government reserved certain areas, notably in the Middle East, where it wished to be able to wage wars which could not be termed self-defense in a strict sense. The United States also made a reservation preserving its right to make war under the Monroe Doctrine. None of these reservations were included in the text of the Kellogg-Briand Pact itself, and the British reservation was rejected by Canada, Ireland, Russia, Egypt, and Persia. The net result was that only aggressive war was renounced. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, 1928, was a weak and rather hypocritical document, and advanced further toward the destruction of international law as it had existed in 1900. We have seen that the First World War did much to destroy the legal distinctions between belligerents and neutrals, and between combatants and non-combatants. The Kellogg-Briand Pact took one of the first steps toward destroying the legal distinction between war and peace, since the powers, having renounced the use of war, began to wage wars without declaring them, as was done by Japan in China, 1937, by Italy and Spain, 1936 to 1939, and by everyone in Korea in 1950. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed by 15 nations, which were invited to do so, while 48 nations were invited to adhere to its terms. Ultimately, 64 nations, all those invited except Argentina and Brazil, signed the pact. The Soviet Union was not invited to sign, but only to adhere. It was, however, so enthusiastic about the pact that it was the first country of either group to ratify, and, when several months passed, with no ratifications by the original signers, it attempted to put the terms of the pact into effect in Eastern Europe by a separate agreement. Known as the Litvinov Protocol, after the Soviet foreign minister, this agreement was signed by 9 countries: Russia, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Romania, Lithuania, Turkey, Danzig, and Persia, but not by Finland, which refused. Although Poland had no diplomatic relations with Lithuania, and the Soviet Union had none with Romania, the Litvinov Protocol was one of the first concrete evidences of a shift in Soviet foreign policy, which occurred about 1927 to 1928. Previously, Russia had refused to cooperate with any system of collective security or disarmament on the grounds that these were just capitalistic tricks. It had regarded foreign relations as a kind of jungle competition and had directed its own foreign policy toward efforts to foment domestic disturbances and revolution in other countries of the world. This was based on the belief that these powers were constantly conspiring among themselves to attack the Soviet Union. To the Russians, international revolution within these countries seemed a kind of self-defense, while the animosity of these countries seemed to them to be a defense against the Soviet plans for world revolution. In 1927, there came a shift in Soviet policy. World revolution was replaced by a policy of communism in a single country and a growing support for collective security. This new policy continued for more than a decade and was based on the belief that communism in a single country could best be secured within a system of collective security. Emphasis on this last point increased after Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933 and reached its peak in the so-called Popular Front movement of 1935 to 1937. The Kellogg Pact gave rise to a proliferation of the efforts to establish peaceful methods for settling international disputes. A General Act for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes was accepted by 23 states and came into force in August 1929. About 100 bilateral agreements for the same purpose were signed in the 5 years 1924 to 1929, compared to a dozen or so in the 5 years 1919 to 1924. A codification of international law was begun in 1927 and continued for several years, but no proportions of it ever came into force because of insufficient ratifications. The outlawry of war and the establishment of peaceful procedures for settling disputes were relatively meaningless unless some sanctions could be established to compel the use of peaceful methods. Efforts in this direction were nullified by the reluctance of Britain to commit itself to the use of force against some unspecified country at some indefinite date, or to allow the establishment of an international police force for this purpose. Even a modest step in this direction, in the form of an international agreement providing financial assistance for any state which was a victim of aggression, a suggestion first made by Finland, was destroyed by a British amendment, that it was not to go into effect until the achievement of a general disarmament agreement. This reluctance to use sanctions against aggression came to the forefront in the fall of 1931, at the time of the Japanese attack on Manchuria. As a result, the peace structure based on Versailles, which had been extended by so many well-intended, if usually misdirected, efforts for 12 years, began a process of disintegration, which destroyed it completely in 8 years, 1931 to 1939.